Hello and welcome to the Blueness Guide, the ultimate guide to ideal nutrition. Today we are going to address the crucial question of proteins, these essential macronutrients for the formation of human tissues. We will first define what it is, before looking at the functioning of this molecule, its virtues, and its generally recommended daily contributions. The entire initial portion of this podcast will be available to all, while the second part, which is reserved for Blueness members, is denser and will delve much more deeply into the optimal contributions of proteins in practical application. For different scenarios like Mediterranean diet, ketogenic, for athletes or even elderly, this is applicable. I kindly invite you to visit the website blueness.com for the second part in order to gain access to that specific section. So, what are proteins? Proteins are vital molecules for humans, as the body can't produce them independently. Proteins, just like lipids, are crucial, unlike carbohydrates that are not essential. Proteins function as hormones, that is, they impact organ control, for example, but also as enzymes in various biological processes. It will function as catalysts for chemical reactions, that is to say, accelerators or triggers. Lastly, proteins act as antibodies of the immune system. They also constitute certain structures of the body, like connective tissues, cartilage, bones, skin, hair, and of course, muscles. It is typically their most well-known and prominent role in the collective imagination. A significant portion of proteins is stored in muscles, as a building block, not or little as an energy source. The body utilizes three macronutrients, proteins, carbs, and lipids, as an energy source for metabolism and vital functions. However, in reality, proteins are the macronutrients that are least prioritized by the body in terms of energy source utilization. Let's say that proteins are simply not mobilized very efficiently to quickly provide fuel to the body, unlike carbohydrates, which are mostly mobilized as long as we have them in stock and during energy needs related to, for example, intense activity, before reserve fats take over, especially when insulin levels are low and during low-intensity needs such as walking, for example. Hence the need to increase one's activity and movement in general, and not only during very intense physical activities. This is also the trap that many people who want to lose weight fall into. These people engage in short and intense physical activity, which is good for overall health, for the renewal of mitochondria, which are small energy powerhouses in cells, and for which we will dedicate separate content. But by only doing that, it can happen that these individuals increase their blood sugar, thus through intense physical activity and a carbohydrate-rich diet, their insulin levels inevitably increase, and all while, moreover, most of the time, the rest of the time, outside of their sports session, relatively sedentary. Besides 2, 3, 4 or 5 hours of intense physical activity per week, the rest of the time these people are sedentary, which actually hinders the mobilization of stored fats. That is why it is interesting, beyond sports, to increase overall movement activity, especially low-intensity movements. To come back to proteins, they are not mainly used as an energy source, but rather as a kind of building block that renews tissues such as skin, nails, hair, and muscles. This is why this macronutrient is so consumed by bodybuilding practitioners. Moreover, in a search for longevity and good health, we are precisely trying to spare the muscle stock and to use either ingested carbohydrates or carbohydrates stored as glycogen being the sugar reserve in the body, or stored lipids or lipids provided by the diet. The goal is therefore to preserve one's muscle mass for as long as possible, especially at an advanced age. That is the reason why weight loss can be effective when both carbohydrate and fat intake are reduced, but only up to a certain point in the process of losing weight. Nutritionists recommend this kind of effort only for fairly short periods of 1 month, a month and a half at most. In addition to that, it is the muscles that are susceptible to catabolization, which is the breakdown of muscle tissue. It'd be counterproductive because rebuilding muscle takes a lot of time, especially at an advanced age. Additionally, sedentary individuals would also benefit from consuming proteins regularly and in sufficient quantities according to their needs, and will return to their needs as the body doesn't store ingested proteins for later reuse, unlike carbohydrates or lipids, for example. Also, it is important to note that for maintaining health and proper body function, the body must continuously produce new proteins. This requires a relatively constant supply of amino acids, which form proteins, and it requires energy, as the synthesis of new proteins is a particularly energy-intensive process. To give an example, hair is renewed approximately every 2 years, and the outer layer of the skin every 3 weeks. However, any factor that impedes or hampers protein synthesis can quickly lead to a loss of lean tissue, which is extremely detrimental and harmful to health. In terms of composition, proteins are made up of amino acids that are linked together by chains. Said in reverse, amino acids are therefore molecules that, combined together, form proteins. There are 20 amino acids that form proteins. They are called proteinogenic amino acids. Some of these amino acids are essential because the body cannot synthesize them itself. It is necessary to ensure the consumption of these essential amino acids, 8 in number, or risk deficiency. A lack of essential amino acids is typically characterized by fatigue, a weakened immune system, weakened ligaments, etc. These 8 essential amino acids include leucine, isoleucine, valine, lysine, methionine, threonine, tryptophan, and phenylalanine. The 2 semi-essential amino acids are histidine and arginine, considered semi-essential due to their importance for infants. And finally, there are 10 non-essential amino acids left. All these amino acids are more or less unknown to the general public, but athletes are a little more familiar with these names because some of these amino acids are sometimes offered as supplements, especially in the case of endurance sports, which aim to renew muscle tissue. Protein-rich foods. On the animal side, we will find eggs, meat, fish, seafood, dairy products, and cold cuts as sources of protein. We will not dwell any longer on the list of protein-rich foods, as a dedicated content will be provided for them at a later time. From a plant point of view, plant nutrients rich in proteins are a very high-quality food source because they have many benefits in addition to their protein content. And among these foods, we can find notably chickpeas, lentils, legumes, tofu, soy, peanuts, nuts, and seeds. And to a lesser extent, cereals, rice, oats, and rye. Just take into account that their consumption inevitably involves an intake of carbohydrates or lipids, unlike meat, and their preparation may require long steps to reduce their anti-nutrient content, and these anti-nutrients can cause digestive discomfort in some. Moreover, for a mainly or mostly vegetarian diet, it is prudent to consider the idea of protein complementarity, which will be discussed in the upcoming podcast. What energy do proteins provide in terms of calories? You are not unaware that proteins like carbohydrates and lipids provide energy to the body. Certainly, the energy provided by proteins is not necessarily immediately usable by the body as fuel, as could be the case with carbohydrate intake, as we saw earlier. But what interests us here is the objective measurement of what protein consumption will objectively represent in the body. And to objectify this, science quantifies nutrient consumption in the form of a unit of measurement, which is the famous calorie. Even if, according to the main principles of the Blueless Guide, the Ideal Nutrition Guide, the concept of calories should be put into perspective compared to everything explained in our guide, it remains that the calorie is considered as the energy reference, and that ultimately there is still a total food intake to estimate, which is a constraint mathematically speaking, even if the value of this caloric total depends on a lot of factors, among which some are clearly underestimated, like for example the level of basal metabolism, for example, which unfortunately often remains very low. To quantify macronutrient intake, proteins, carbs, lipids, and adjust needs based on experiments in terms of quantity, results, and energy, one must estimate protein intake in terms of weight, for example 100 g meat, 3 eggs, or a can of sardines, and its energy value. This helps understand how to better adjust needs based on the experiments in terms of quantity, results, and energy. Accurate estimation of protein intake is crucial for optimizing nutritional goals and achieving desired outcomes. In calories, and this to convert from one unit of measurement to another, from grams to calories and from calories to grams easily, if we don't know how to do that, we will quickly be stuck in taking control of our diet. As a reminder, we had already seen this before in other chapters of the Blueness Guide. 1 g of protein corresponds to 4 kilocalories. Carbohydrates also represent 4 kilocalories for every 1 gram consumed, just like proteins and fats. On the contrary, 1 g of lipids, which is fat, corresponds to 9 kilocalories. Lipids are more energetically dense than proteins and carbohydrates. Acquiring the knowledge and skills to effectively manage this conversion will be particularly useful when estimating approximately how much protein to consume on a daily basis, which is crucial for determining our dietary needs and maintaining optimal health. In practice, we can infer that 100 g of beefsteak, let's use this example, 100 g of beefsteak with 15% fat will give about 15% of lipids, the fats, as it is a beefsteak with 15% fat, and 15% of lipids in 100 g is just 15 g, and 15 g of lipids is equal to 135 kilocalories. Why? Because 15 g multiplied by 9 kilocalories, resulting in 135 calories. Always in this 100 g beefsteak, we will have 20% of proteins. It is simply written on the label. For 100 g of beef, it's usually estimated as 20 g of protein, not 100 g of protein, by the way. And so, these 20 g of proteins represent, in terms of energy, 20 g of proteins multiplied by 4 kilocalories, which gives 80 kilocalories. Which means that the total calorie content of this beefsteak is approximately 215 kilocalories. This kind of calculation must truly be mastered because it will prove useful when one wishes to estimate how many proteins one should approximately consume to respect a recommended ratio. We will see the recommended ratios a little later in this podcast. Proteins are therefore, along with carbohydrates, the two macronutrients that weigh the least in terms of energy per gram, while lipids are more energy dense. But unlike carbohydrates, proteins are, like lipids, very satiating. That is to say that proteins quickly lead to a good feeling of satiety. In addition, their breakdown in the body will cost energy, which means that 1 gram of protein provides 4 kilocalories, but the metabolism of this protein could cost between 20 to 30% of the consumed calories, compared to only 5 to 10% for carbohydrates and simply 5% for fats, which is much lower. This is what is also called the concept of diet-induced thermogenesis, a concept according to which digestion and metabolism of nutrients can lead to additional energy expenditure. These figures are approximate, but suggest that protein metabolism costs energy to the body, as it is more laborious than the breakdown of carbohydrates and lipids, which could partly explain the satiety effect induced by protein consumption. So in summary on the energy contributions of proteins. To summarize simply, we now know that proteins are contained in certain foods, and these proteins are mainly found in animal foods such as eggs, poultry, dairy products, etc., as well as in certain plant foods. These proteins help to renew the building blocks of our body, such as nails, hair, skin, muscles, and organs. We also observe that 1 gram of protein provides, in relation to energy, 4 kilocalories. Finally, we learned that in 100 g of white meat, red meat, and sometimes fish or seafood, although the content is slightly lower, we find 15 to 25 g of protein, depending on the food. Assume 20 g of protein per 100 g of meat, regardless of whether it's white meat or fish. Let's assume, on average, 20 g of protein per 100 g of meat, on average, for the purpose of simplification. In other words, remind people starting to control their diet. 100 g of proteins, 100 g of meat, and 100 g of meat, 100 g of proteins. In 100 g of meat, typically only about 20 g of proteins. The rest is a bit of lipids, water, micronutrients, and other food constituents. To summarize, we found that from 100 g of meat, which gives around 20 g of protein, and typically between 5 and 15 g of fat, we can estimate the calorie content, that is, the energy supplied by consuming this food, which is approximately 215 kilocalories per 100 g, slightly lower for leaner meat. To provide perspective, with the average caloric intake of a 70 kilograms individual, estimated to consume 1,800 to 2,600 kilocalories, this is a rough estimate. Proteins are the fundamental macronutrients to be supplemented with carbohydrates and fats based on the chosen diet. We also learned to convert calories to grams and vice versa, enabling accurate prediction of protein-rich food consumption for optimal health, weight loss, muscle gain, and longevity in an absolute way throughout this content and beyond. It is to achieve this goal that we are somewhat obliged to understand all this. So the fact, for example, that 1 gram of protein is 4 kilocalories, or that, for example, if we start with calories, we have to divide by 4 to get the number of grams of protein. Having knowledge of the suggested protein intake, we can easily make adjustments to our protein consumption by weighing the food using the information we have just acquired, thereby applying what we have learned. To determine how much protein-rich food one can consume regularly, it is necessary to ascertain the recommended protein intake by the authorities. And let's finally see if nutrition opinion leaders have more specific opinions, especially for special cases, such as advanced age, practicing a sport, seeking longevity and good health, or simply following a low-carb diet, such as a low-carb or even ketogenic diet. So what's the recommended protein intake? The protein needs vary from person to person, but depending on age, physical and intellectual limitations, etc., there are multiple factors. The body will require different quantities of proteins to maintain efficiency and health. It depends on factors. A bodybuilder who also does canoeing and kayaking, for example, will not have the same protein needs as a relatively inactive bodybuilder, who will not have the same protein needs as an endurance athlete, who is by definition active, and who will not have the same needs as a completely inactive person. That is why it is important to test different protein intakes over several weeks in order to find one's optimum, starting with a rather low fork at the beginning, based on official recommendations, and gradually increasing according to goals and feelings. But what is this low fork that the public authorities recommend? That's what we're going to see right now. ANSES is the public organization assessing health risk in France. It recommends consuming 0.83 g per kilogram of body weight per day, around 62 g of protein per day for a person weighing 75 kilograms. ANSES, the National Agency for Food, Environmental and Occupational Health Safety, advises on health risks in France. EG, 100 g of meat, white or red or white fish, usually have about 20 g of protein as seen, and 3 eggs also have about 20 g of protein. Following these recommendations, for a 75 kilograms individual, 3 eggs in the morning, white or red meat at lunch, and fish in the evening would cover the 60 g protein recommended by French authorities for a person weighing 75 kilograms. Furthermore, in 2016, ANSES working group established second protein distribution recommendation based on total caloric intake. This specific recommendation indicates that proteins may constitute approximately 10 to 20% of the total calories consumed in a person's diet. For an individual who consumes around 2,000 calories daily, which typically corresponds to the average person, this would amount to a daily protein intake of 50 to 100 grams, equivalent to first recommendation, lower end of range. Greater tolerance for higher protein consumption seems to go along with story, but we'll come back to that. Finally, regarding the maximum protein intake per day, ANSES estimates that based on current knowledge, an intake between 0.83 and 2.2 g per kilogram of body weight per day of protein, which represents 10 to 27% of the energy intake, can be considered satisfactory for an adult individual under 60 years old. In some cases, it would not be harmful to consume up to 2 g per kilogram of body weight. This is a major breakthrough, especially in Western Europe, where proteins are still relatively frowned upon. Indeed, consuming high amounts of protein has been somewhat considered as a taboo practice until this point in time. 2 g per kilogram of body weight equals sign about 150 g protein for a 75 kilograms person, and that's significant. Obviously, this upper limit, this high range, should be reserved for people who need such a protein intake, especially resistance athletes, relatively bulky elderly people, in order to slow down their sarcopenia, that is the decrease in muscle mass with age. In the United States, the USDA recommends daily protein intake based on the percentage of total calories, so approximately, that's what they recommend, 10 to 35% of total calories compared to 10 to 27% for ANSES in France. So here once again we transition from a relatively low range to a range that is still quite high. What is the amount of protein in grams that can represent 10 to 35% of the total calories? The lessons learned at the beginning of this chapter will guide us. Here's our plan. To convert calories, a caloric percentage into grams, we need to revisit what we said initially, that 1 gram of protein is 4 kilocalories. For the USDA, protein intake is 10 to 35% of total calories. We'll use a median value of 15%, which may apply to a relatively sedentary man in his 30s who occasionally does sports on weekends. Assuming this man consumes 2200 kcal day, approximately the average intake for this type of individual, 15% of these calories would be 330 kilocalories of proteins, calculated as 15% of 2,200 kilocalories. And to get the weight, we take the 330 kilocalories of proteins that we divide by 4, since we know that 1 g of proteins is 4 kilocalories, which would give approximately 82 to 83 g of proteins per day. 83 g of protein per day is roughly equivalent to 4 servings of 20 g of protein spread throughout the day, or 3 larger servings. So we selected 4 portions of 20 g because a steak, 3 eggs, or a serving of fish each represent approximately 20 g of weight. In practice, 4 eggs in the morning give 24 g of protein, 100 g of chicken cutlet at noon, give 24 g of protein, 150 g of cottage cheese or skyr in the afternoon as a snack, give 15 g, and a portion of fish for dinner, give approximately 18 to 20 g of protein. Through this quick calculation, and especially this practical implementation of the meal plan based on the calculations, we realize that for many individuals, we are frankly very far from the mark. We can see here that in order to be in an optimum, there are still 4 reports in Popin, and apart from some athletes who follow this kind of recommendations, most ordinary individuals are far from the mark in terms of protein intake. Otherwise, many people think they are doing well by eating little or prioritizing vegetables, but they find themselves, despite themselves, finally, without knowing it, deficient in proteins. In fact, protein intake is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts, whether it be in a standard diet, a healthy Mediterranean diet, or even a low-carb or ketogenic diet. In some cases, too little protein is consumed, and in other cases, far too much, and from poor quality foods. In other words, There are numerous errors on this crucial central subject for achieving an optimal diet. To never have to doubt its ideal contribution to protein for health, longevity, lean mass gain, and fat mass loss, here's what we will learn in the second content reserved exclusively for 1S members. We will see what lessons to draw from the recommended daily protein intake that we have just seen. Should we increase our protein intake or not? For individuals who need to increase their intake compared to the recommendations, what would be the optimal range in practice? Protein intake for sports, protein intake for ketogenic diet, protein intake for Mediterranean diet, and protein intake for the elderly. What are the recommendations? And ultimately, we will determine the ideal number of proteins we should consume on a daily basis and the criteria for adjusting our protein intake. In this content, we will certainly hold the keys and ultimately understand the frequently poorly explained and poorly applied secrets associated with protein consumption. If interested in this premium content, visit bluenest.com, log into member area to view in text format and podcast format. See you soon on Bluenest website.